At long last, it's finally here. After 5 years of wait, 5 years after the last mainline Sonic game, Sonic Forces, we finally have another mainline Sonic game. Sonic Frontiers was released on November 8th, 2022 for all current gen and last gen consoles as well as Steam. The lead up to the release of this one was quite a roller coaster of emotions to say the least. Sonic Forces disappointed a lot of people back in 2017, and in the 5 years between that game and Frontiers, very little has happened to prove that Sonic is still a franchise worth following. In 2018, we got Sonic Mania Plus, a decent DLC to an already great game, although by this point, it really does look like Sonic Mania was the only thing that keeps the franchise going. In 2019, we got Team Sonic Racing, a racing game with barely any content and was basically dead on arrival since Sega barely supported the game, leading to the online scene to be basically empty. We also got a trailer for the upcoming live-action movie that looks god-awful. Thankfully, the movie was delayed, the model was fixed, and it turns out the movie was okay. Nothing great, but it was at least an enjoyable watch. Moving forward a bit, in May of 2021, we got Sonic Central, and that event announced a few things. The Sonic Symphony, which was amazing by the way, some collabs, but more importantly, they announced Sonic Colors Ultimate, Sonic Origins, and the upcoming mainline Sonic game set to release next year. Sonic Colors Ultimate turned out to be a buggy disaster, and Sonic Origins, while not as bad as Colors Ultimate, was still pretty lacking. At least this was the general consensus. FYI, I didn't play any of them because none of them interest me. This doesn't really inspire much confidence for me in the franchise. I mean, the only good thing to come out of the 5 years between these two mainline releases are a DLC of a good game that, as a whole, over-relied on nostalgia, and 2 decent movies. This lack of confidence was only exacerbated when more gameplay was revealed. So, of course, we get the title reveal of Sonic Frontiers, and then the first gameplay was shown by IGN, and it looks awful. We see a lot of pop-ins all over the place, the controls look awkward, the puzzles look embarrassingly basic, the island design just looks like a bunch of rails placed in the air, some of the animations look very janky and unfinished, it just does not look like a fun game to play. And that's how I, and a lot of other people feel after seeing the initial gameplay. A lot of people were just not convinced at what Sonic Team has on the table here. But then, as more gameplay was shown, things started to change. More and more people were actually excited about Sonic Frontiers. Oh, how the turntables, as they say. Speaking for myself, while yes, the later gameplays look far better than the earlier ones, I was still not fully sold on this game. But it looked good enough that I was pretty sure I was gonna give it a shot. Although, I had already planned for this video to be a follow-up for the Sonic Forces video ever since I started work on that 2010 Sonic retrospective, so I guess buying the game was inevitable for me. But alas, the game dropped, and while I didn't pre-order it, I did buy the game day one. And for this review, I'll be playing the Steam version specifically. I don't have any of the next-gen consoles, so this seems like the next best thing, because while my PC is not amazing by any means, it's good enough to run the game smoothly, albeit not with the highest setting. Although, some of the performance problem can probably be attributed to the de novo DRM plaguing this game. Yes, Sega just won't stop ruining a bunch of their game's performance by adding in a pointless anti-piracy meme that gets cracked mere days after release. From a rhythm game that requires precise input to a remaster of 30-year-old games, everything Sega releases on Steam has performance issues. Well, golly gee, isn't that wonderful? But anyways, enough rambling. After my conflicting thoughts throughout the pre-release of this game, after playing it, how do I feel about the game? Without any further ado, this is my review of Sonic Frontiers. Not to my surprise, a lot of my concerns about this game came true. The awful pop-in, the overly simplistic combat, a lot of the rails in the islands just being placed in randomly with no rhyme or reason, the controls are kinda awkward at point with very little momentum in it. These are all things that I was concerned about before the release of the game. And these things are all indeed things that you can criticize the game for. And yes, these are things that I don't like about the game, but I wouldn't exactly call any of this a deal breaker. answer. It's gonna be hard to say everything I want to say about this game, so let's take it slow and talk about my experience on the first island, and then we'll go from there. Oh, and by the way, if you haven't played the game, I recommend doing so before watching this video, as this will be a spoiler-filled review of Sonic Frontiers. That said, let's begin with my first impressions on Kronos Island. When I first heard Iizuka saying that this was gonna be an open zone game, at first I thought that it was just some marketing thing, as I guess open zone sounded more Sonic-y than open world. And while that might still be the case, honestly, after finding out more about this game, and of course playing it, I kind of understand what they're saying here. This game is split into 5 islands, each island being a massive hub, an open zone if you will. So it's not exactly one gigantic world, but rather 5 big hubs. And I gotta admit, I really like this concept for Sonic. But of course, the important talking point here is, how's the execution? The overworld design is very important when it comes to a game like this, of course. It can pretty much make or break the quality of the game. And for Kronos Island at least, I really dig it. Sure, the puzzles are easy, the rails feel like they're just randomly placed in thin air, and some of the island feels kind of empty, but it's really satisfying to just run through the island and try to clear the obstacle courses as fast as possible. Climbing this tower was pretty fun as well, and yeah, I had a lot of fun on this island. Of course, that does bring up the question, what do I think about the way you traverse this island? That being the controls. And I'm very mixed on this one. I mean, it's fine overall, but I just really don't like the lack of momentum. I know Sonic fans are tired of hearing this, but when I imagine open world Sonic, I imagine being able to use my momentum to find new ways to explore the world. Creative ways that the developers may or may not have intended. While some of that is present here, I mean you can still use your speed creatively, such as boost jumping from a grind rail, or drop dashing to climb up an incline, but it feels way more restrictive than I would have liked. Not only is there next to no momentum, it's also not clear which incline you can or can't climb. Aside from that, there are also other control problems, like the air boost for example. In Sonic Forces, air boosting can cover a huge distance, and in a game like that with small linear stages, that's a big problem of course. But in a big open zone like this, something like that would have been a perfect fit. And while we're at it, in terms of restriction, my god, can this game be restrictive sometimes. I mentioned the obstacle courses / platforming challenges before, and while those can be fun, they can be incredibly automated. It's not too bad here at least, but it can be boring just watching the game play itself for a few seconds. One thing that I must praise the controls in this game for though, are the options. You can tweak Sonic's movement here to whatever suits your playstyle the best, and really, having that range of customizability is great. Well, me personally, I just cranked up every setting to the max, but I know that other people have their own preferences. Aside from the controls, you can also customize the UI, and how many elements of it you want on screen. You know how in Breath of the Wild you can choose either the normal HUD mode or the Pro HUD mode? The Pro setting basically removes all of the heads-up display stuff, with the exception of your health. Well, Frontiers allow you to pick and choose which elements of the HUD that you want on screen, and it's great to have that option. You can play the game without the compass, without the game constantly showing your stats. You can play the game with no HUD at all. Something that would usually require mods in previous games is just something that you can do on the settings now, which is great. It's actually really fun to play the game while turning off all HUD elements and just appreciate the environment. But anyways, enough of that. Let's talk about something else now. One of the main things advertised on the pre-release of this game, aside from the huge expansive world, was the combat. And it's alright. I mean, don't get me wrong, at the beginning it's fine enough, and as you unlock more moves from the skill tree, yes, this game has a skill tree, it can actually be very satisfying to string different attacks after one another. But it does feel a bit button mashy, especially on Kronos Island where you can just spam the left trigger while fighting any enemy and just win easily. Although later on in the game, enemies do get stronger, thus encouraging you to unlock new moves and use the variety of moves available. So the combat is satisfying, but as something that you do a lot in the game, it just feels too shallow. It definitely gets tiring after a while, as by the second island, I was already skipping enemy encounters a lot. Of course, it only makes sense to talk about the enemies you face throughout the Starfall Island, more specifically, the Guardians. And they're fine? I mean, most of them are very basic and just follow a simple pattern, like parry an attack and then wail on the boss, or chase down the boss and then you can attack it. They can get pretty boring after a while, some even frustrating, but even at their worst, they're still tolerable. Defeating the bosses will give you portal gears, which you can use to enter cyberspace, and I guess it's about time we finally talk about that. The cyberspace levels are some of the worst content I've ever played in a Sonic game. I'm honestly shocked in spite of my low expectations. They already look bad in the pre-release, but it's frankly still shocking how much they managed to screw this up. These levels are so bad, they make Sonic Forces look like an amazing game. You'd think that the basic Sonic stages would be the easiest to handle by this point, instead of being the absolute worst parts of the game, but I suppose not. First, let's start off with the controls. In spite of the jank I mentioned earlier, for the most part, the open zone controls are good enough. And as I said, it even allows you to customize certain things, like Sonic's acceleration or turning speed. In cyberspace, not only are you not given these options, but the controls that you're given here are complete garbage. The jump feels weird, not exactly sure how to describe this one, but it just doesn't feel quite right. Sonic's movement feels as awkward as it was in Forces, but now the boost is so nerfed it doesn't even have that going for it. Not only is the speed of the boost unbelievably sluggish, you also can't boost through enemies this time. You'll just get smacked down if you attempt to do that. I mean, why? I get why they did this in the open zone. I mean, it makes sense that they want to emphasize combat more there, but here, where your only means of attacking is just the homing attack, it just feels awkward. And then we have the levels themselves. Oh boy. At first glance, I already have a problem. These stages have 4 themes and only one of them is an original theme. We have Green Hill, Chemical Plant, Sky Sanctuary, and this new city-like cyberspace theme. I mean, seriously, these 3 again? Man, I don't care what new story excuse they have for continuing to reuse these stages over and over again. I'm just sick of seeing these. And to make matters worse, a lot of these stages just straight up reuse layouts from the previous games. Honestly, whenever I'm playing one of these stages where they reuse the design from a previous game, I was honestly wishing I was just playing the original game instead. You're basically getting the exact same level, only now you're playing with the control that's 10 times worse. And when you do get original levels, they're honestly just mediocre. They're not really that fun to play. I may be able to appreciate them more if the controls weren't this terrible, but the reused assets, unremarkable level design, and terrible controls all combine to make up some of my least favorite stages in Sonic history. And as an addendum, I would like to add that the fact that these stages don't really have unique themes make them really unmemorable. One of the reasons why I love Sonic so much, one of the things that makes Sonic levels, is because every level feels like they had a reason to exist. They had unique themes, memorable set pieces. But the cyberspace stages, however, well, it's just impossible to tell these apart from one another. These stages don't even have names. Most of the time, when you hear people talk about cyberspace stages, it's usually gonna be something like, oh, it's this city level with grind rails and stuff. Oh, it's this chemical plant themed Metal Harbor clone. When in previous games, you can easily call back to certain levels. I guess you could make the argument that these cyberspace stages are taking inspiration from the shrines in Breath of the Wild, but well, not only do shrines actually have names, the unique puzzles also set them apart from one another. Let's also not forget that the shrines were also criticized for similar reasons. So yeah, these cyberspace stages really are a disappointment, but let's not dwell on them for any longer and just move on for now. After you get enough keys from the cyberspace stages, you can unlock the Chaos Emeralds from these vaults. And after getting 6 of the Chaos Emerald, you can find the final emerald in each of the islands as Titans, and after getting the final emerald from the Titan, well... Oh my, what is this? Usually other Sonic games save this hype stuff for the end, but I guess Frontiers is just giving this to us right at the start of the game. And man, it is great. I mean, I don't know what else to say. The footage just speaks for itself. These supersonic boss fights are just a treat to play, with fun gameplay, great spectacle, and of course, amazing music. Well, I guess I haven't mentioned the music at all in this video so far, and it's amazing. Aside from the amazing boss themes that are just the most hyped things ever, We also have the more quiet and atmospheric island themes that fit each of their respective islands very well. And while I'm not the biggest fan of most of the cyberspace themes, I will have to admit that I do genuinely enjoy some of them. But anyways, back to the Titan fights. Yeah, they're great. Sure, you could argue that these fights are all style over substance, but for me at least, the style is just so good here. And the fights are still filled with enough substance that I hardly care for the lack of depth that these fights have. In terms of gameplay at least, I don't know, I just can't not enjoy these fights when I'm blessed with these amazing visuals and music. So, I'm already talking about these Titan boss fights, but I haven't even talked about the story yet. Well, let's change that. The story of this game was one of the few things that I was actually cautiously optimistic for during the pre-release of this game. Specifically when they announced that Ian Flynn was going to be writing the dialogue for the game, who has been writing for Sonic comics ever since the Archie days, and has continued to write more for the IDW stuff. I haven't read much of the comics, but from the stuff that I've heard about them, they don't sound half bad, specifically in terms of characterization. Characterization has been one of my main problems with the Sonic stories that we've been getting recently, so hearing that the person who's gonna write the dialogue for this game is someone who's actually familiar with these characters and has been doing work on this franchise for years, well, that's definitely one heck of a good news. And I gotta say, the character writing in this game doesn't disappoint. I love how this game shows off the side of Amy that isn't just fangirling over Sonic. You know, the caring and compassionate side of her. I love seeing Sonic and Knuckles banter, but also care for each other like brothers. I love seeing Sonic motivate Tails, reassure him that yes, he is not a burden. He is useful. He has a lot of potential. He can grow into his own person. This genuinely feels like a great extension of his arc from the adventure games. They even managed to handle his character in a way that recontextualizes events from Lost World or Forces. I still don't like those scenes and the way that they characterize Tails in those games, but to try to fix these things instead of just retconning them or ignoring them is truly a mark of a great writer. And of course, I love how Sonic is just Sonic here. No obnoxious or unfunny joke, no more being this pretentious jerk that people have to unfortunately rely on to save the world. He's a speedy hedgehog with a heart of gold, never giving up, always there to help his friend. He's someone who can take things seriously when the situation demands it. He's everything I love about his character growing up. He's Sonic the Hedgehog. Sorry for getting a bit ahead of myself, but man, these characters just mean so much to me. And to see them finally treated with the respect that they deserve after over a decade of flanderization, it just means a lot to me. But I suppose that's enough about returning characters. How about the newcomer here? Sage. Well, I mean, I like some things about her, I suppose. The father-daughter relationship between her and Eggman is a neat idea, and it's one that I quite enjoy when looking at the full picture. The problem is, some vital information relating to this plotline are stuff that you can only see by reading the egg memos, which is one of the rewards that you can get for doing the optional fishing minigame. Usually, these egg memos serve as neat extra stuff to either state something that was already implied through the cutscenes, or just serve as neat little callbacks, and just give Eggman some little time to shine, since he isn't really that big of a focus in this game. But aside from these egg memos, all you get are these, like, 3 or so cutscenes where Sage and Eggman just stand around in cyberspace. So I guess there's at least some build up to this being a thing, but not nearly enough for this to have the impact that it's supposed to. One noteworthy thing about this game's story, though, is the amount of callbacks and references to past events, and how it also expands on some parts of the previous games' lore. Now, when I say callbacks, I don't just mean cheap stuff like this stupid little Generations line from Forces. I mean that the characters actually nonchalantly mention events from the previous games, and for the most part, it actually feels natural. Well, most of them anyways. Some, like the Dark Gaia callback, feels a bit forced, but most of them, yeah, they just feel like these characters calling back to things that they've experienced, which also helps confirm that yes, this is all one continuous franchise. We're not just playing through a bunch of one-offs. The Sonic that we're playing as right now is the same Sonic that went to that interstellar amusement park, put the Earth back together after it was split apart, defeated Neo Metal Sonic, and fought many giant supernatural monsters that's supersonic. And as someone who spent years of his life being invested in these stories and characters, it feels very reassuring. And in terms of how this game expands the lore, well, of course, if you played Sonic Adventure, then you really can't ignore how the ancients look very similar to Chaos here, which does make me wonder even more about the origins of them. And also, throughout the game, you encounter these Cocos a lot, and if you pay attention to the cutscenes, you'll realize that the ancients all have a Coco in their chest. And also, throughout the game, you'll have these quests to help the Cocos, and once you're finished with the whole storyline revolving around each of the islands as Cocos, you'll see that they are actually just third playing past events, and that their fates are already set in stone. But Sonic still helps them anyway, because of course he can't just ignore someone indeed. You know, Sonic still helps these Cocos because even if their fates are set in stone, he's just helping these Cocos die in peace. Man, the character writing in this game is just so good. I could go on, but you get the point. Thing is, the plot of Frontiers is not exactly a lot to write home about. At the end of the day, it's just a basic plot where you get stranded on a mysterious island and need to save your friend. And the ending is a bit messy. We'll go over that in a bit. But how this game expands the lore and how much it excels at writing these characters just makes it up to me and then some. I really don't ask for much when it comes to Sonic stories. Just have it take itself seriously when it needs to, have some hype and exciting moments, have well-written characters, and there you go, that's all I ask for in a Sonic story. And to me, in spite of all of its flaws, Frontiers' story is one that I feel satisfies all of that category, and therefore, I feel is a success. I'm just so glad to see a new Sonic game actually be interested in telling a proper story, to treat these characters with the respect that they deserve. I mean, the last time that happened was, what, Black Knight? So, yeah, I guess that's all I have to say about the story for now. Let's get back to some more gameplay stuff by getting to Ares Island. Ares Island is no doubt the best island in the game. It has the best platforming challenges, it feels the most open, it's the best at what the open zones are trying to do. So, after Kronos does a good job introducing you to this open zone gameplay, with an island that still feels expansive, but it's relatively small compared to the other island. You get dropped into this massive desert with just a whole lot of things to explore. I mean, it's hard to even begin. The main reason why Ares Island is just so fun, it's that it's just such a fun, massive playground for Sonic to move around in. Alongside that, you have these small but satisfying platforming challenges just like the previous island, and this big platforming challenge inside of a ruin. Kronos Island already worked pretty well, and Ares Island is just more of that, and bigger. This feeling of constantly one-upping the previous island is also sort of carried on to the Titan fight here. Giganto feels very hype of course, but I guess it just feels like a basic Titan fight, like a way to introduce you to these bosses. It's still great, don't get me wrong, but compared to the other Titans, man, it's not even close. Wyvern though, I mean, you're literally flying through the entire island as you fight it. The spectacle here never fails to impress me. I've heard people compare these fights to set pieces from games like Metal Gear Rising Revengeance, and honestly I agree. With this music and QTEs and all that, it's honestly just impossible for me to not think of MGR. Oh yeah, and the music here is also great of course. After the absolute highest point of the game, we immediately get treated to the absolute worst part of the game. Oh my god, Chaos Island is just awful. It's split into multiple separate parts, so because of this obtuse layout, traversal is just confusing. And this island loves to spam these 2D platforming sections that, once you get in, you can't get out of. Chaos Island is just not fun, but on the flip side, at least it contains the best Titan fight in the game. Knight is just the best. You're riding this shield and picking up this ridiculously large sword, while you also get treated with the best song ever. Oh my my gosh, this boss fight is just perfection. Now we're approaching the end of the game, starting with the second to last island, Rhea Island. Rhea Island is a bit different from the other islands. In a sense, it's more of a mini island per se. The objective of this island is to climb up 6 towers, and that's it. After doing the same thing over and over again for 3 islands, I'd say that this is a welcome change of pace. And honestly, I think climbing the towers is actually pretty fun. The platforming here is pretty enjoyable, and it's probably the one time where the platforming is actually very focused in the open zone, instead of being more so mini challenges that are scattered around the islands. So I know that not everyone likes this island, but for me, Rhea Island was a fun time. And now, finally, we're at the 5th and final island, Kronos Island. By this point, I was already getting tired of the game and basically ready for it to be done. The formula was already kind of getting old by the 3rd island, but now it's even worse. Kronos Island just feels kind of unremarkable to me. It's a decent island, I guess, but again, because I was already tired of the game by this point, I had a hard time trying to enjoy this one, until eventually, I just found one of Big's fishing spots, and after half an hour of fishing, I just sort of bought everything I needed there. Oh yeah, I guess I haven't talked about fishing yet. In each island, you can find this portal that looks similar to the cyberspace portal, but with a fish logo, so you know what that means. Fishing here is actually kind of fun and relaxing. Instead of the at best boring and at worst frustrating fishing gameplay of SA1, fishing here just feels like a way to relax. Sure, you could argue that there's barely any gameplay here, just press the A button at the right time and you're good. But I'd argue that that's the fun of it. After exploring these mysterious open zones, fighting the island guardians and all that, it feels relaxing to just go fishing or cook something for a while being accompanied by a familiar friend and this relaxing music as well. However, the fishing here isn't perfect, of course. The most notable flaw it has is how it affects the game's balancing and structure. The way that you get access to fishing is by collecting these purple coins. I guess at first it works fine, but something that will inevitably happen in your playthrough of the game at least once is the Starfall Night event thing, where a lot of stars fall from the sky, allowing you to spend them on the slot machine. Just getting one of these can boost up your purple coin count by a lot, especially if you manually stop the slot machine by using the D-pad. By the time I got to the fishing spot in the final island, I already had hundreds of these. Now, you can get these fish tokens by fishing, and with the fish tokens, you can buy some stuff, including the egg memos, which I mentioned earlier, and other gameplay related stuff like the vault keys and memory tokens. So, you can basically skip the entire island if you want to. And yeah, this is a bit broken. I guess you can count this as an alternate way to go through the game, but like, spending half an hour on fishing takes less time and effort compared to actually exploring the island, which is exactly what I did to skip a lot of Kronos. So this just feels a bit too much, I suppose. But with that, I guess I've said everything I wanted to say before we get to the finale. So let's get into it. The finale of Frontiers is kind of a topic of contention amongst the community, and I can definitely see why. In all honesty, the endgame of this game is a mixed bag. Let's start with the final Titan fight. Supreme just pales in comparison to the previous Titan fights. Even Giganto, honestly. It just feels the least hype and the most janky. All of the other Titan fights always have a sort of jank element to them, but it's felt here the most. This jank, and the fact that this Titan fight just doesn't feel as hyped as the previous Titan fight, just makes up for the worst Titan fight in my honest opinion. And if you're playing on easy or normal difficulty, this is it. This subpar Titan fight that is worse than any of the other ones is just gonna be your last impression of this game. And that's just lame. If you played on hard mode, you'll get one last treat before the game ends. And it's this Ikaruga type game where you fight against this random moon. Alright, let's talk about this. To the game's credit, the end doesn't just show up completely out of nowhere. It's this mysterious voice that talked to Sonic ever since he first arrived on the Starfall Island. But I don't know. Having the final boss just be this random moon that was barely even set up before this in any way, it just feels, again, lame. And in terms of gameplay, well, I gotta admit, It's actually pretty fun. They took the hacking minigame and made it more challenging, gave it more depth. It's a pretty fun Ikaruga clone. I just wish there was more. If this were the first phase of a bigger boss, I'd have no problem. But the thing is, this is all there is to the boss, and that just feels, again, lame. And story-wise, Sage sacrificed herself, which should have been really impactful, but in the cutscene right after the boss fight, Sonic doesn't really react to it, which just feels wrong. Why couldn't he react in the same way that he reacted when Shadow died? Man, this ending's a mess. And yet, in spite of that, I still felt something after I finished this game. Sage's sacrifice actually did something to me. Sure, it would be even better if Sonic had actually reacted to it, but still, I'd actually grown to care for Sage's and Eggman's father-daughter relationship, and for Sage as a character as well, in spite of the flaws in the execution department that I mentioned earlier. But I guess it's finally time to wrap this up. So, I guess now we only have one question left to answer. So, how was Sonic Frontiers overall? Sonic Frontiers is one of those games where, when talking about the pros and cons that it has, well, I'd have a lot to say about both. This game is far from perfect. The cyberspace stages were not great, the controls can be questionable, the combat is simple and it's just way too easy. I could go on, but it's one of those games where the good stuff just outweighs the bad stuff for me, even if there is a lot of bad stuff. When I think of this game, I always think of the fun I had traversing the open zones, how hyped I felt when fighting the Titans. In spite of its flaws, I'll always remember this game fondly. And man oh man am I glad to say that. After years of being doubtful of this franchise, it feels so nice to have that faith that I once had to be restored. Seeing other people on the internet be happy about the new Sonic game just makes me really happy in a sense. Above all else, this game just reminds me why I love Sonic, why I stuck around after all of these years, in spite of its inconsistent quality. Because when Sonic is great, it can be some of my favorite gaming experiences of all time. And while I wouldn't say that Frontiers is that, it's certainly on the right path. At the end of the day, I'm just glad that I finally get to experience what it's like to enjoy a new Sonic game. I've stated in this channel before that I got into the series with Generations. I played it back in 2014 and I loved it. I loved it as a kid and I still do now. Of course, ever since then, with the exception of Mania, the Blue Blur was kind of in a rough spot. And after being disappointed once I finally played Forces, even though my expectation wasn't even that high to begin with, and then have Colors Ultimate and Origins look so unappealing that I just skipped them entirely, I'm just glad that now I'm able to play the newest Sonic game and have fun with it, and have other people enjoy it with me as well. Sonic Team may still have a long way to go, but I am happy to say that I am no longer worried for Sonic's future. In fact, I've never been more excited for it. We still have upcoming content for this game, all of which look very good, and they're gonna be free by the way. I mean, that's just amazing. But if they continue on the right path, they're gonna be able to make something truly special. I am certain of it. I'm looking forward to the day where they'll finally find their flame once again. Until then, Sonic Team, keep working towards your one-way dream. There's no doubt in my mind that if you reach for the stars, you'll make it.